Douglas Shinneman is a research fire ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey Forest and Rangeland Ecosystem Science Center in Boise. He investigates how plant communities and disturbance regimes are influenced by land use, non-native species, and climate. And also joining us today is Dominic Kulikowski. Dominic is an associate professor of geography and biology at Clark University, where he also directs the Forest Ecology Research Lab. His research is focused on the disturbance ecology of mountain forest ecosystems in the U.S. Rocky Mountains and the European Alps. And to finish us out, we have Paul Rogers, who is an adjunct faculty member in the Department of Wildland Resources at USU, a USU Ecology Center Associate, and the Director of the Western Aspen Alliance. His research on indicators of forest resilience has taken him around the West as well as to Northern Europe and Eastern Africa. And with that, I'm going to turn the time over to you, Douglas.
All right, thanks. And thanks everybody for attending. I appreciate it. So my presentation is going to parallel very much a paper that I published last year along with Dominic and Paul, who will be speaking later, and Bill Baker. And it's of the same title, and it was published in Forest Ecology and Management in 2013. And similar to the paper, I will discuss, and that's the paper, sorry, I'm a little behind on my slide advancement here, but similar to the paper, I'd like to quickly discuss a brief overview of aspen fire ecology, discuss methods to understand and reconstruct fire regimes. And by fire regimes, of course, I mean a characterization of fire history for a landscape or a given community type using quantifiable fire parameters, and in particular, frequency and severity measures. I'd like to synthesize existing research literature that pertains to estimating aspen fire regimes in the western U.S., or the Mountain West, as we referred to them in this paper. Suggest a conceptual classification framework for aspen fire regimes in the Mountain West, and then identify key knowledge gaps and research needs. And I see my numbers and bullets did not translate very well here on my screen. But hopefully you can all follow along. So I think, when we think of aspen, I think there's a tendency to think we maybe know quite a bit about fire in aspen. Aspen is often considered an early cirral and fire-dependent species. But increasingly it's recognized as one that can be fairly stable on the landscape as well, and one that is often relatively fire independent. And so I think that's an okay way to think of aspen in terms of the spectrum of fire conditions, but even that classification as either being cirral or relatively stable is probably too simplistic. In fact, we should expect that aspen fire regimes would be quite variable given the diverse biophysical and climatic gradients over which we find aspen, not only throughout North America, but even in the Mountain West. What we do know about aspen is that in terms of fire behavior, is that it's relatively resistant to fire. Lightning ignitions are relatively rare in aspen stands. Aspen is not particularly flammable. It has a fairly low rate of spread. In fact, fires have been often reported to go out after entering an aspen stand from adjacent conifers. It has a relatively low probability of burning, at least relative to the surrounding landscape that may be more conifer dominated. We also know that as the conifer component increases in an aspen stand, we tend to have more fire, so there's a greater probability of fire occurrence. But of course, that's a simplistic view. There are a lot of things that dictate or influence fire probability and behavior, including fuel load, seasonality, the environmental setting, past disturbance effects, and so on. When fire does occur in aspen, it's relatively safe to say that it's generally a high severity fire event, in that aspen and conifer, especially aspen conifer mix, is very prone to producing crown fire conditions. Aspen is easily top killed, and even when aspen survives a fire, the trees are often weakened and vulnerable to subsequent disturbance agents like insect and disease. There is some evidence for mixed severity fire in aspen, particularly where the fire is of more low intensity. Certainly some aspen can survive under those conditions. But there's relatively limited evidence for any sort of a low severity fire regime that would actually maintain older aspen trees on the landscape like we might think of for, say, ponderosa pine. And we know this to some extent because for one thing, fire scars in aspen are generally fairly rare or absent in most stands, and we also know that aspen is susceptible to pretty high mortality rates, even from low-intensity surface fires, generally due to thin bark and other conditions. Fire in aspen, or I should say aspen does respond to fire very well, though, in terms of post-fire regeneration. It's an early successional species. It's relatively shade intolerant. So we certainly could consider it a fire-adapted species. It is capable of prolific post-fire regeneration, typically in the Mountain West through vegetative reproduction, resprouting or suckering. But increasingly, we're understanding too that sexual reproduction is more common than once thought, and fire-exposed mineral soils are very suitable for that type of regeneration. But the productive ability of aspen after fire can be fairly extreme. It generally responds very well. There's been reports in the West of over 200,000 stems per hectare just a few years after fire. If we think again about the spectrum, or the two ends of the spectrum, as being sort of seral versus stable, and we think about the successional trends that occur within those types of stands, seral stands tend to, in early and mid-successional stages, are often characterized as being relatively even-age stands, and over time they're gradually recolonized by conifer seedlings, and as those stands become older in age, conifer become more dominant in the overstory, and there might be some scattered old aspen patches and some patchy recruitment, but by and large it becomes more conifer dominated and more likely to be fire prone as that conifer component increases. In contrast, persistent or stable stands are generally considered to be relatively self-sustaining. They may start off with an even age stand structure, but often develop a multi-cohort age structure, which suggests enough recruitment of younger trees into the overstory to be stable. And they regenerate both through continuous or episodic recruitment after fire, through canopy gaps at a fine scale, but also through broader scale disturbance events that might reduce the apical dominance and allow regenerative activities to occur, and we get more suckering in the understories of those after those mortality events. And you can see an example of that in the picture in the lower right. Well, one of the challenges with defining and characterizing or quantifying fire regimes in aspen is that the evidence of fire can be quite ephemeral. Aspen in particular are relatively short-lived trees. We don't have old aspen like we have conifers that might record fires over periods of hundreds of years. Aspen are also very prone to a fading record problem. Not only do aspen decay fairly quickly, but even the snags after fire have a relatively short retention time. And there's also a burning record problem. If a stand does experience a stand replacing fire, that fire often wipes out evidence of previous fires. So we often don't have a very long time frame to characterize the fire regime for a given landscape. And so whether you're studying aspen or anything, another challenge is to just have a large enough landscape that can capture the fire size distribution and the severity, and enough of a record within that landscape to characterize fire occurrence over time to be able to really adequately quantify fire regimes. We can, of course, use methods that are used elsewhere in other forest types. We can date fire scars. In most aspen-related fire history studies, those scars come from conifers. We can also use stand origins under the assumption that the oldest trees in a stand most likely initiated relatively soon after fire, and if we have enough sampled stands and we can establish stand ages, we can use those stands to calculate a fire rotation for a given landscape. Stand age structure, or the tree age structure within a stand, is also useful, where we have a full age distribution. We can often infer past population and disturbance dynamics within aspen. So for instance, if we have a fairly even age stand that has evidence of past fire, that certainly would suggest a stand replacing disturbance that may have initiated that stand. And of course, there's other techniques we can use. We can look at the charcoal record, historical records, and so on that can provide corroborating evidence of aspen fire history. So one of the things we did in this paper is we sought to review as systematically as possible all of the papers that we could find that dealt with aspen fire regimes. And we had a few criteria for including past research. The research had to have either looked directly at trying to reconstruct fire history, or measured stand ages or tree age distributions within multiple stands to make inference or speculate about the fire history of a stand. The study also had to be of landscape or regional scale so that we really could characterize fire regime beyond just, let's say, a small point on the landscape. And so when we reviewed the literature for those types of papers, we found 46 studies that met these criteria. And you can see those studies numbered to the left. Those numbers correspond to a bibliography in the paper. But you can see that we do have a fair number in the Central Rockies and the Southern Rockies and so on. But of all those papers, only 12 could really be considered fire history studies, where there was actually an effort to reconstruct the mean fire return interval within the research. And of those, 10 used conifer scars. Only 2 attempted to use aspen scars. And one research effort actually looked at the stand age and used that to calculate a landscape scale fire rotation. The remaining papers, although they may have addressed fire, typically speculated more about past fire history based on overall stand age distribution or within stand tree age structure. So not as direct in terms of actually having direct fire evidence to study necessarily, but did make some inferences about the past fire history of those landscapes. Out of the 46 studies total, 20 of them indicated that some or all of the stands sampled were likely relatively stable without fire. And you can see from the geography of those studies that we find them where we find a lot of aspen for the most part, the Southern Rockies, the Middle Rockies, Utah, Northern Colorado Plateau, and so on. But there obviously are some holes as well. So in the process of summarizing what we know about the fire ecology of Aspen and looking at these studies that might provide insight into fire regimes and trying to classify fire regimes, we developed a fire regime conceptual framework, a classification framework that I'm going to present to you now. And I'll spend a little time on this slide. The fire regime types that we identified were defined by 2 main predictors: mean fire severity, which is represented on the y-axis, and annual probability of fire, or frequency of fire, essentially, which is on the x-axis or the horizontal axis. Within that 2 predictor space, you can see the numbers correspond to the 5 proposed fire regime types that we introduced in this paper. And the lines, the colored lines between the numbers, roughly, conceptually indicate the delineation between those fire regime types within that 2 predictor space. And I'll just kind of go through each one of those now and talk about them. So the first type, as you can see, is an aspen type that we've called a fire-independent stable aspen. It generally has very little fire, and fire is often of low or maybe mixed severity. These are stands that generally are comprised of pure aspen, often are very large in more mesic or protected environments from fire, and just don't have conifer competitors for the most part. And so there's not really a risk of succession to more mature conifer-dominated stands. And for the most part, these stands have little evidence of fire when they're studied and have multi-aged cohort structures that suggest the ability to be self-sustaining on the landscape. Somewhat similar to that type, number 2 is a fire-influenced stable aspen. And really the main difference here is that these also are fairly pure stands and often don't have conifer components within them, but might be a little less protected from fire. Maybe they're smaller patches, less topographically protected locations, and so on. And so they may burn, but it's not clear that fire is really necessary for those stands to persist. The third type is the fire-dependent conifer aspen mix. This is generally a low elevation aspen type that coexists with ponderosa pine in particular, where low to mixed severity fires are fairly frequent. And they're severe enough to produce enough overstory mortality or to kill enough aspen that aspen sort of persists in a sort of patchy and minor component on these landscapes. The fourth type then is what might be considered a more classic Cyril montane aspen community. These are aspen stands that exist at more mid-elevations and mixed conifer communities that experience mixed to high-severity fires that are relatively frequent enough that it may produce sort of a shifting mosaic of aspen and conifers over time on these landscapes. And so this is the kind of landscape that you might find in some locations in the Southern Rockies or Utah, for instance. And then finally, very similar to the number 4 is a fire-dependent cereal subalpine aspen conifer type. And the primary difference here is these are much higher elevation conifer communities, more spruce and fir. And fire is far more stochastic. It's far less frequent, but when it does occur, it can be very large and very severe. And so aspen waxes and wanes over time with these very dynamic fire regimes. And so you may not have sort of an equilibrium type of a state, but more of a very constantly changing proportion of the landscape with aspen over great time periods. If I have time, I'll just quickly touch on, well, I'm going to pass on that. Sorry, there's one other type there I wanted to talk about, but I'm going to run out of time. What we found in terms of research gaps is that, relatively few studies estimated fire rotation or landscape mean fire return intervals. And so clearly that's a need. There needs to be more good landscape scale replicated research that attempts to both date fire scars and date age structures and develop a better assessment of the fire regimes within aspen. But as I alluded to earlier, that's a challenge given the complexities and the difficulties working in aspen and looking at long time frames and large landscapes. And so new techniques could certainly help in terms of our interpretation of age structures and estimates of fire regimes. I won't go into all these in great detail, but certainly maybe calibrating the rate of aspen to scar after fire using modern fires would be helpful to know to what extent low severity fires might actually occur in aspen. Using radiocarbon or isotopic composition data with tree rings could be useful in terms of more precise dating or documenting fire events. Considering how genotypic variation related to fire events might be useful. And determining the influence of other disturbance agents and how they might affect fire regimes would also be useful. Last 2 quick points. There's a paucity of research clearly in parts of the West where aspen may be less common, like the Great Basin or the Northern Rockies, but no less ecologically valuable. And very little was said about riparian aspen because there really is very little research in terms of fire regimes within riparian aspen communities. So just summarizing then, I think we should move beyond an overly simplistic view of aspen fire regimes as being either fire dependent or fire independent or more stable, but think about these more complex landscape environments that exist over a diversity of biophysical gradients across the Mountain West, and recognize that the relative dependency of aspen community on fire is correlated with its relative stability on the landscape in many cases. And in terms of management implications, if restoration is our goal, we need to avoid sort of a one-size-fits-all approach to management and restoration of aspen. And with that, I'll close. Thank you.
And now I will bring up Dominic Kulikowski's photo and PowerPoint.
Okay. Thanks very much, Rose, and thanks very much, Doug. So Doug did a really nice job of categorizing aspen fire regimes. And what I wanted to do in the little bit of time I have is to think about what the consequences of changing fire regimes and other disturbance regimes might be for quaking aspen. So in that context, when we talk about climate change, and of course climate change is related to changes in fire regimes, etc., we can talk about the direct effects of climate change, meaning how do altered temperature, precipitation regimes affect plant demography, etc. How do droughts play into plant demography? Or we can talk about the indirect effects. And by indirect effects, I mean changes in climatically driven disturbances, like the fire regimes Doug was talking about, like insect outbreaks, etc. And then so collectively then, the question becomes, what is the effect of all of this on the composition of Rocky Mountain forests, including the dominance and extent of quaking aspen? So first of all, just to talk about briefly changes in fire regimes, warm and dry conditions result in increased wildfires, increased bark beetle outbreaks, and especially in coniferous forests. And as Doug mentioned, the regeneration of aspen is intimately linked to fire regimes, which is our first hint that any increases in fire extent, fire frequency, fire size might indeed favor aspen regeneration, and therefore the amount of aspen that we have on the landscape. This is a figure from a study that we published back in 2004 in which we compared the amount of aspen in the landscape in the late 19th century, that is the late 1800s, versus the late 20th century. And one of the things we found here, and this was an area of Grand Mesa, which is in western Colorado, and one of the things we found is that there is actually more aspen in the landscape right now than there was about 100 years ago or more. And the reasons for that are explained in this table, and we don't have to look at all of it, but briefly, the rows in this table describe forest dominance in the late 20th century, and the columns represent forest composition 100 years ago in the late 19th century. And so, for example, if you look at the middle column, what that column is indicating is that of the area that was dominated by spruce and fir in the late 19th century that burned, 62% of that area is currently dominated by aspen. And you can kind of interpret the rest of this, and this table is straight out of that 2004 publication. But the only point here is that there were many large, extensive, and severe wildfires in the late 19th century. And this table shows that those fires actually led to an increase in the total amount of aspen we have in the landscape. And of course, some of these stands are now seral, again becoming dominated by the conifers, and that in fact is a return to conditions that were typical of a period 100, 150 years ago. So when we talk about successional replacement and mortality, one important point is that the severe fires during the late 19th century increased overall aspen cover, at least in western Colorado. Another point, which may be somewhat counterintuitive, especially in the context of conversations about aspen decline, is that, again, at least in this portion of the landscape, there's actually more aspen right now than there was about 100 years ago. This isn't necessarily true for everywhere in the West, but this longer time perspective should at least work its way into our conversations about aspen dominance and aspen decline. And so if we think about this kind of on a theoretical level, in the upper figure, you have a line that depicts decreasing aspen cover over a 50-year time period. And one point I'd like to make is that in order for us to be able to assess whether or not that decline is something we need to be worried about, is that we need to understand something about the long-term variation. Because if you have something like that which is depicted in the middle figure, which is relatively slight variations in the amount of aspen in the landscape, and then a major decrease, then we can legitimately say there's a decrease in aspen. We should think about what to do about that. But if what we have is actually really broad fluctuations in the amount of landscape that may be associated with infrequent and severe fires, then maybe what we're noticing is not necessarily something out of the norm, but rather just something infrequent. And so in the context of climate change and changes in fire regimes, one thing we should think about is what are the consequences going to be if fires get larger, maybe more frequent, maybe more severe? And we'll come back to that question. And just as a footnote to this conversation, Doug pointed out that aspen is less flammable than conifers. So just by that virtue, if you have an increase in fires, presumably most of that increase will be in coniferous forests. So because you'll have fewer coniferous forests, we're likely to have more aspen, even setting aside questions of regeneration. Another thing that's important for us to think about in terms of looking forward to the future is compounded disturbances. We know that the extent, magnitude, and frequency of disturbances are increasing. And again, this applies to wildfires, insect outbreaks, etc. And when we have two or more disturbances occurring in a short period of time, we can have somewhat unpredictable consequences that we don't completely understand. So as an example of this, this is a photograph from Drought National Forest in northern Colorado. And this particular stand in the foreground was affected by a windstorm in 1997 and then a severe fire in 2002. And what we did was we looked at what the effect of these so-called compounded disturbances were on regeneration. And if I can just draw your attention to the line that is associated with quaking aspen, which is the solid line with a dot on it, initially regeneration following only the fire was co-dominated by quaking aspen and lodgepole pine. But interestingly, if you look at the figure on the right, when we looked at stands that were affected by the windstorm and then the severe fire, we found that aspen was by far more dominant in dominating post-fire sites, meaning that aspen seems to do better after compounded disturbances than the conifers. And again, this is likely related to the regeneration mode because the seed sources of conifers were eliminated, or at least reduced in this case, whereas aspen was still able to reproduce vegetatively. And in addition to that, as Doug mentioned earlier, there was actually some examples of sexual reproduction in this case. So that was a brief discussion of the indirect effects of climate, altered disturbance regimes, and we'll come back to it again in just a moment. But if we turn our attention now to the direct effects of climate, one thing we know is that aspen demography is contingent on climate, meaning aspen establishment and mortality is driven by temperature, precipitation, etc. So another way of framing that question then is, what is the direct effect of the same climatic conditions that indirectly favor aspen? That is, if it's warm and dry and we have an increase in fires, that increase in fires may favor aspen. But what about those warm and dry conditions? How do those affect quaking aspen directly? In another study we did, we sampled quaking aspen that are similar to those depicted in the foreground of this picture, which is aspen stands that have died over the past about 15 or 20 years. And this was again in western Colorado and southern Wyoming. And one interesting thing we found in aspen that had died is that there was a significant correlation between tree growth and spring temperatures, such that growth was negatively correlated with spring temperatures, meaning that trees grew more under cooler conditions and aspen trees grew less under warmer conditions. We also looked at the effect of precipitation, and we also found a significant relationship between aspen growth and precipitation, such that the wetter the conditions, the greater the growth of aspen. So taken together, cooler, wetter conditions favor aspen growth in this region. Warmer and drier conditions inhibit aspen growth in this area. And then in this figure, the bars depict the number of trees, the number of quaking aspen that died in our study area during each particular year within our study sites. And the line represents a drought index, such that negative values represent greater drought. And one of the things we found is not only does temperature and precipitation affect aspen growth, but actually pulses of aspen mortality are associated with drought conditions, which are the result of an interaction of temperature and precipitation. So growth and mortality of quaking aspen, even away from transitional zones, so we're talking about in the core of their distribution, are strongly associated with climate. And specifically, the growth of aspen in this area is inhibited by warm temperatures, and the frequency of mortality events is associated with prolonged drought conditions. So if we step back now and we put this whole story together, we have changes in climate that are leading to more fires, which would probably lead to more aspen in the landscape. Those climatic conditions are also leading to more outbreaks and more compounded disturbances, both of which would lead to more aspen. But the same climatic conditions are causing more drought, which we know can lead to less aspen in the landscape because it's a direct driver of aspen mortality. So then what does all that mean for the future? Well, the answer to that question comes down to the relative importance of disturbances versus climate. If the effect of disturbances is going to be more important, probably there will be more aspen in the landscape. But if the effect of climate will be more important, we'll probably have less aspen in the landscape. And of course, this is all contingent on aspen's ability to survive and regenerate under future climatic conditions. And if we think about some of the feedbacks that might kick in, here's one scenario. So let's say the effect of disturbances is more important. So aspen is favored because conifers are, at least to some degree, removed from the equation. So we have more aspen in the landscape. We have fewer fires for the reasons that Doug mentioned earlier. We will also have fewer outbreaks of mountain pine beetle, spruce beetle, and so forth. Probably fewer compounded disturbances, and probably less wind damage to forests. And all of this could actually lead to a negative feedback, which may be a stabilizing factor for disturbance-driven ecological change. Alternatively, if the effects of climate end up being more important, well then most likely we're going to have less aspen on the landscape. And then the question becomes, well, what happens next? Well, we could have more conifers, but that's unlikely because of the reasons we just discussed, namely that the conifers are actually more disfavored by changes in climate than aspen. So the more likely scenario is that we would actually have a conversion from forest to non-forest vegetation. So to sum up, increases in individual and compounded disturbances have the potential to promote aspen dominance, but only if the post-disturbance climate is suitable for aspen survival and regeneration. The flip side of it is that continued drought has the potential to hinder aspen dominance and might actually lead ultimately to a conversion from forest to non-forest vegetation. Coming back to the initial question, what are the consequences of changing disturbance regimes for quaking aspen? Well, as this brief conversation illustrates, they're likely to be complex and contingent on the effects of post-disturbance climate, as well as feedbacks among climate, disturbances, and forest composition. So thank you for your kind attention, and with that, I will pass it on to Paul, and then we can take questions a little bit later.
Okay, great. Well, I have just a little bit of time here, but both Doug and Dominic presented a lot of excellent information about, particularly about physical environments and disturbance interactions, and so what we know kind of in the current sense of our knowledge of Aspen science about those things. I'm going to try to put those into to some bit of a human context and then talk about sort of options or ways forward in the management context. And this is going to be a bit of a juggling act, and this is a work in progress, so I'd like your feedback either during this conversation or afterwards. So I'm really headed towards this target of resilience, and I know that's kind of an ambiguous term, but I've couched it here in terms of what we know, the reality, the probability, and probability is really a lot of the conversation that Doug and Dominic just led us through, and then talking about dynamic futures and how we might react to those things. So without further ado, I'll proceed. Just a quick outline here, this reality part or what we know. I'm going to talk a little bit about these different functional types or functional ecology of Aspen. A lot of that's been covered, so I'll go fairly quickly with through that. And then this idea of the probability, trying to kind of hedge our bets and using what we know about these different types in the context of drought and disturbance, and that'll latch right on to what Doug was just explaining in the later part of his talk. And then I'm really going to try to get into more the management realm. So what do we actually do practically on the ground? How do we tackle these situations as kind of complex and dynamic future? And I'll look at some of these confounding factors, many of which you're already aware of, but it helps us to remind ourselves what we're talking about. And then the course corrections, the actual what do we do on the ground, and how do we make that work? And then this, I'm very big fan of this idea of a monitoring and adapt cycle. So as we do things, we need a way to check on ourselves to make sure that what we thought would happen would actually happen. So, whoops. There we go. Okay, so in terms of what we know, what I'm calling the reality here, perhaps a little presumptuous, but this is what we think we know about these systems. Both Doug and Dominic talked about stable and serial aspen, and what we've done is come up with sort of a continental level framework, and I really want to emphasize this is a framework, sort of a starting point for looking at different types of aspen systems at a very broad scale, at a continental scale. And this is a paper that's going to be published any day now, as far as I know. It's been in the works a long time. But we have these different aspen types, and what we mean by functional ecology is that there's basic principles of how these systems work that are different and make them amenable to treating and looking at differently. And it's important that we understand those so we avoid what Doug called that one-size-fits-all type prescriptions. Because the subtleties and the differences can play out in the landscape, and we have many examples of folks doing the wrong things for the wrong types in the past. So that's all I want to say about that. Let me put a picture on those. So these are these photographs of these different types here. I won't really talk much about the boreal and parklands. Those are primarily in Canada. This montane type covers a lot of territory and was alluded to in some of Doug's fire types earlier. The elevation aspect limited. Oftentimes we'll find pure or stable aspen on a south or west-facing slope, and just over the ridge you can see in that photo a conifer-dominated stand. Very large pure aspen stands across the Colorado Plateau and other places, but that's one region where we see these large flat-top mesas that are covered by relatively pure aspen communities. A whole host of different terrain isolated types, in this case just a little snow pocket. There's actually, if you look real close, a home built in there, but surrounded by non-forest types. And then riparian types can be either pure, like the one in the photo, or a cereal type. And we discern these different types by using a bunch of different categories and then combed the literature, reviewed over 100 studies to come up with these different types and try to parse them out based on those categories there, those variables. Just for fun here, I tried to put Doug's and our paper that was a fire ecology, trying to put those types on some of these because I anticipated that someone would ask, well, you've kind of shown us two different typing systems today. How might these fit on there? But really, the montane type is very broad and encompasses probably at least 2 or 3 different fire ecology types for Aspen. The elevation aspect limited, similarly, that's the one that was semi-independent of fire. So if you get enough conifer buildup in adjoining vegetation communities or other flammable communities, that it spills over into Aspen occasionally, and then those very large stands in the Colorado Plateau that are more pure rarely, if ever, see fire for long periods of time. And then there's some more variability within the terrain, isolated or the riparian communities. And the riparian, as you can imagine, is heavily influenced by subterranean water. So a lot more moisture there would, in general, repel fire, but that could vary depending on conditions. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about what I kind of see as probability. Now, this photo was sent to me by a person I do a lot of work with, Mary O'Brien, from southeast Utah area. And there's a lot of, we could have a whole seminar on what's wrong with this photo, but you can see that's on a gas pump and it's advertising some local activities. But I want to get into, when we're talking about climate futures and things, this is probably sending some wrong messages, but in terms of direct physical impacts, the sort of tearing up of aspen environments is probably not a very good thing. But just generally in terms of warming, and Dominic talked quite a bit about this, I won't spend a lot of time. We expect to see warming in temperature, and that would have some direct and indirect effects, as he talked about. The drying is highly more variable. In our area, for example, I'm in northern Utah. We're pretty clear that future projections will show warming, but very unclear about the precipitation factor. We do realize that with shorter winters, a lot of that precipitation will run off faster, so that could have varying effects depending on where you are around the west. I wanted to contrast these two things, and it's a different viewpoint, but ending up at the same place is what Dominic was saying. But this idea of a shrinking habitat for aspen with drying is certainly something that we should consider and be a little bit worried about. It's basically moving up in elevation and perhaps northward in latitude. So there is a factor, but we place that up against or contrast that with, if you have more fire under drying scenarios, you would expect to see an expansion of aspen. And then, of course, Dominic's work on multiple disturbances also favors aspen. So I won't belabor that point anymore. Dominic made a good point of that earlier. So what I'm trying to do with this slide is just show you that there's a lot of variability in trying to predict things, but we can have some idea of reactions to certain conditions depending on those different types. So if you're in a fire-prone aspen type, or in a non-fire-prone, or in one that is occasionally prone to fire, you might see very different reactions to this, to warming and potentially drying futures. So I just wanted to kind of put a picture on this. If in this situation here we had a fire, this happened to be a prescribed fire that went a little farther than it was intended to in south central Utah. So this is a montane aspen community. That's how we would functionally type that. So we would expect the fire to occasionally play a role, but you'll notice the patchiness in this photo, the high variability. In the areas where there's more aspen cover, there was generally less burning, and were more conifer cover, more thorough burning, and then of course a mix of fire severities across this landscape. What I want people to understand here is in this serial type, we would be more dependent on these catastrophic or stand replacing disturbance events, not only fire, but really the species composition in this landscape plays a central role in the situation. If we contrast that with this Colorado Plateau stable type, this is actually not far away from the last photo, also in central Utah. We see a very different system, one that where species variety plays very little role. I'm talking about the tree cover here, where large-scale disturbance, stand replacing disturbance, plays very little role. But aspen regeneration of a continuous and episodic nature is really crucial to this system. And I think most of us can tell just by looking at this photograph that that has been interrupted probably in a very severe way. We just see really one generation or one size of trees out in the landscape. Probably some variation in the age, but one size of trees, and there's really a missing generation or two or three in this situation. And so this is in a highly vulnerable, very low resilience kind of system because if we understand the functionality of this type, we know that it needs continuous regeneration of some type. So just to put a picture on things there. Okay, so now moving into this third section of the presentation, looking at, so what do we do about this? How do we manage toward resilience? Well, we have a few barriers along the way. One of those we have to admit is some past management practices, and I talked about things doing management or treatment practices in the past that were inappropriate for the functional type. In this case, we had a serial system in which there was a clear cut because we could regenerate a lot of aspen, but everything was browsed off. So perhaps the clear cut wasn't the best way, but even more importantly here, some follow-up protection in this situation could have prevented a really poor outcome. In this case, we've really converted a forest into a non-forest environment in this area that was cut. Similarly, in the western U.S., we have a lot of development. You know, how does that affect our managing for resilience by appropriate functional types? I would argue that it's probably maybe more appropriate if we continue to develop along these avenues to do more active management near developed areas and less active management at a distance from developed areas. In this case, it's not always widely known that aspen can be used as a fire break. I'm not advocating that we develop more. I'm just saying when we're put in these situations, what are some of the confounding factors to having resilient, intact functional systems? And then, of course, we're all very familiar with herbivory, and this is probably a severe case of herbivory where we just happen to catch these animals on a motion-censored camera, but again, we see that there's a couple of generations missing of regeneration and recruitment. And this scenario of putting all of our eggs in one basket, so to speak, all in that older age class, is just doomed for catastrophe because, as was pointed out earlier, aspen's a fairly short-lived species, so it's going to run out of steam, and then we have no next generation to back it up. So, of course, in climate, I just didn't have another good, cool climate slide to show here. These are all kind of things that can interrupt our course towards resilience management. So I don't have time to go into detail here, but you can look at this at a later date. What I've done is put up just a few examples of problems, how we might approach them, some probable causes, and for us to think about them, for example, in that first line, and not just assume that if there's conifer encroachment, this was a problem with fire suppression or this is a problem with climate, but to do the background research at a local scale to discern what exactly is going on there, or maybe a combination of things. And then what are some potential solutions to that, and then what are the metrics that we can measure to gauge that. And you can follow that chart. I'm a little behind on time, so I'll kind of move through. The point I'd like to make here is that these metrics should be geared towards appropriate functional types. So for example, if you're in a stable system on the Colorado Plateau, in that second row there, the metrics are really geared towards what's the regeneration and recruitment health of that particular stand. What are the amount of animal visits that might be probable browsers that are causing your problem, and so on. So, and many of these metrics are already published, and you can take those off the shelf, so to speak. Okay, so I'm going to try to sum it up here and couch this in terms of what I call a monitor and adapt cycle. The first box there is really a lot of what was given in the first couple of presentations, is understanding historical change and adding that to the functional types that I described, and times the disturbance. So we have what are the likely disturbances in that area, what's happened in the past, and how do we put those in the right grouping so we understand what kind of aspen we have on the ground. And then we implement some procedure if we find that there's a problem there. We monitor whether that worked or not, make some adaptive change, and then loop back towards implementation so we get it right, so to speak. So we're a flexible adaptive system as we move forward. All of this is headed towards a resilient Aspen system, and I tried to use sort of a fading color there to give the idea that resilient Aspen, a little bit nebulous term, but something that's more resistant to change that's outside of natural pathways, is only a filter sort of toward the impacts we're going to have coming from climate. What I mean by that is that it's not foolproof. I don't want to give anybody the idea that we can manage everything towards a resilient bin and then we're all safe. But it does hedge our bets, and that's probably a key point of my talk. Is all of these approaches are meant to try to hedge our bets in that direction, as long as we're adaptive along the way and able to monitor what our successes and failures are. So with that, I've just listed some resources here, both Dominic's and Doug's and our recent papers on fire, as well as this background material on functional types, some recent work on herbivory in the middle of the page there, in drought-prone landscapes, and some of the metrics we use to evaluate that. As well as Jim Worrell's work out of southern Colorado in terms of aspen habitat and contractions of that might be expected. I also want to alert folks to this very valuable resource that's really easy to use at the top of this box, but basically you can get drought reconstructions for your area. This is a continental scale grid that you can download and try to start constructing sort of a local drought past for your area. And so that's a very valuable tool that's easy to use. With that in mind, I just want to acknowledge the folks that I work with, a lot of the Forest Service regions, the BLM, and the folks here at Utah State University. And I think we can open it up to general questions at this point.
Thank you, Paul. I have collected a few questions from the chat pod. This first question is directed towards Doug. Barry Johnston asks, how would you distinguish stable aspen stands that are fire-related from stable aspen stands that are not fire-related?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one could certainly set out to design a study, an observational study, by identifying potential locations where you would expect a relatively low occurrence of fire and where you have pure aspen stands, and then those maybe spanning some sort of a gradient where you might increasingly move into more fire-prone parts of the landscape, and see if to what extent you find evidence of fire within those different stand types. You know, again, the framework that we proposed was a conceptual one. I think there's a lot of empirical data that need to be collected and analyzed to back up those proposed fire regime types. And so I think to the extent that we can get out and get good data in those different proposed fire regime types to back up those classifications, that would be really useful. And that's a perfect example of one where the delineation would be, I think, interesting and challenging to delineate between those two different types that are pretty closely related.
Thanks for that answer. We have another question. This question is towards Dominic. Please address the potentially differing effects of climate on aspen of different age classes and how this might interact with disturbance.
That's a really important question, and it's one that I don't have the data to answer directly. But anecdotally, what I've seen is that in some aspen stands where the canopy trees are dying, the younger aspen stands are also dying. But in other stands, only the canopy trees are dying, and the sub-canopy trees appear to be perfectly fine. And so I think that just goes back to one of the points that Doug made earlier, which is that we should avoid falling into a one-size-fits-all approach when we're talking about climatically driven aspen mortality. The other thing that's related to that is during the same years in which we saw canopy aspen dying in places where aspen formed large contiguous stands, is that we saw aspen regenerating from seed at relatively high elevations in areas that were previously dominated by conifers. And so the point there is that actually the same climatic conditions that might lead to mortality of canopy aspen, especially at lower elevations, might actually facilitate an expansion of aspen via sexual reproduction to higher elevations.
And now I'll go back to asking another question. This question is for anyone who cares to answer it. In stands where fire may have typically favored aspen by causing conifer mortality, is there a level of conversion to conifer where aspen regeneration after fire may not occur due to limited energy stores below ground?
This is Paul. Let me take a shot at it. By the way, that's a long time research need that I don't believe has ever been adequately asked. So I didn't catch you ask that question, but you kind of cut right to the bone of one of our crucial research questions that we need to work on. But here's my shot at it. I think that they're in a stand, let's just say hypothetically it's 95% conifer and there's a few aspen left in there. Most of that root system that presumably was larger at one time, I'm not going to say dominant, but larger, has deteriorated, so it really has run out of energy. But even with a moderate disturbance, you should see some regeneration and recruitment in the coming years around that. It would be quite limited, and it may take a few rounds of these compound disturbances to regenerate vegetatively. The wild card in this scenario, of course, is something that Dominic just alluded to, and we're seeing more and more of. The more we look, the more we find is that reproduction by seed. So I did my best to answer a difficult question that certainly needs more investigation.
Thank you, Paul. It looks like we have just one more question. This is from Wes, and it's directed towards anyone. Please discuss the challenges of understory aspen competing with heavy fern growth.
Well, I'll jump in, and then the others can chime in if they wish. Actually, we don't have much of that in our area. I know there's quite a bit of that in Colorado, so maybe Dominic could jump on that after I'm done. But basically, I think if it's really heavy, you would need some disruption and perhaps a late season fire to that for aspen to come up. Having said that, I think that in almost any stand, and I know somebody will nail me for this, there should be some low level, at least, amount of regeneration and recruitment, even with heavy forb or fern cover. And so you should see some continuous regeneration and recruitment without that confounding factor of herbivory. So, Dominic, what do you think?
Our field sites in Colorado, the competition of aspen with heavy ferns is really localized to low-lying riparian areas. So it's something that I've seen in the landscape, but my sense, at least for western Colorado, is that it's not extensive enough to be a real driver. But again, that's a little bit speculative.
Yeah. Yeah, let me add that many folks I run into have really clued in on the idea that you have to disrupt apical dominance to have any regeneration and recruitment, and that's a little too stark of a statement. That you should have in most, as I said earlier, stands some regeneration, and maybe low level, but of a continuous nature in many stands, and the interruption of apical dominance often spurs prolific sprouting, but it's not required to have regeneration.
And could I address one other question that I saw come up in the chat? Okay, so Ken, I think brought up an interesting point, and he said, he pointed to the gas pump photo that Paul showed, and he said, well, this is a multiple disturbance regime. Does this mean more aspen in the landscape? And I think that's a really interesting point to bring up. And one of the points I didn't get to make in my presentation is that I think what we're seeing with multiple disturbances is essentially an increase in the overall intensity, in the cumulative intensity. And that intensity gets bumped up to the point that conifers are disfavored or maybe eliminated, but aspen can still thrive. But I think it's also true that, building on Ken's observation, that if we actually increase overall intensity even more, then eventually there's going to be a point where not even aspen will be able to regenerate. And I think this may be true if, for example, fires get so intense that the underground portion of aspen may be compromised, or, as the gas pump photo suggests, if the soil is disturbed, that might also take the ecosystem on a different trajectory.
Well, thank you so much to all three of you for your presentations. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience would agree. And thanks for your attendance, everyone.